morning and welcome to the 5th meeting of 2025 in Session 6 of the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee. We have apologies today from Paul O'Kane. Our first agenda item is consideration of one negative Scottish statutory instrument, SSI 2025/9, the Sheriff Appeal Court Fees Amendment Order 2025. I refer members to Paper 1. Do members have any comments to make on this instrument? Tess White.
Thank you, Convener. My understanding is the reason for this SSI is an administrative error, and that's why we're here today to discuss it and vote on it if necessary. I just want to highlight one thing, and it came in the consultation and the submission from Citizens Advice Bureau. And Citizens Advice Bureau raised a big concern about rising court fees, and they said, we have serious concerns about the negative impact of the proposed lift in court fees on the realisation of the public's right to access justice, especially those on lower incomes, those who are vulnerable, and for those who have protective characteristics. And I just wanted to put that on record, the feedback from CAB. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Your comments are noted. Maggie Chapman.
Just very quickly, when we debated the original statutory instruments last year in the autumn, I moved a motion to annul all of those because of the barriers that Citizens Advice and others highlighted that increased fees would make. Given this as an amendment of those and my motions to annul didn't go anywhere, I'm not going to challenge this at this point.
Okay, thank you. Would anyone else wish to come in? No, your comments are noted. They're on the record. So thank you. That concludes consideration of the instrument. Our next agenda item this morning is continuation of a budget scrutiny 2025-26. And I therefore refer members to papers 2 and 3 and welcome to the meeting CoCab Stewart, Minister for Equalities, and the Minister is accompanied by Nick Bland, Deputy Director of Mainstreaming and Inclusion, and Matt Elsby, Deputy Director of Fiscal Policy and Constitution. You're all very welcome this morning and thank you for attending. I invite the Minister to make an opening statement before we move on to questions from the members. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you. I'm pleased to be invited back to give evidence to the committee today. I look forward to providing the committee with updates on what I'm doing to ensure equality, inclusion and human rights are embedded in the budget and across Scottish Government wider processes. Regarding competence raising, there is a welcome alignment actually this week for the committee to fall on. Currently, over 1,000 officials from the Scottish Government are participating in Equality, Inclusion and Human Rights Development Academy Week. This is a new initiative that forms a key part in further building civil servants' competence and capability about how to embed equality, inclusion and human rights into everything that we do in government. I was delighted to contribute to these sessions and in a recorded interview I set out the importance of mainstreaming and my own personal commitment to demonstrating visible leadership in this area as the Minister for Equalities. The Government is equally focused on building competence and capability across the public sector. In recent weeks, I have met with Scottish Council's Equality Network and COSLA, as well as over 100 public sector equality duty bearers and 14 equality groups at our equality outcome settings events, where I have communicated my expectations and provided that active leadership. So, turning to this year's budget, it is focused on building a positive future and improving the lives of everyone in Scotland. It does this through our resolute focus on the First Minister's 4 priorities: eradicating child poverty, growing the economy, tackling climate emergency and ensuring high-quality public services. This year's changes to the Equality and Fairer Scotland budget statement focused on improving how evidence feeds into the budget decision-making process and how decisions can be communicated more clearly. Key improvements were an earlier ministerial workshop, publication of gender budgeting pilots and a more streamlined document. Many of the key decisions highlighted in the EFSBS show positive impacts across many protected groups, such as the increase in the availability of affordable housing that will benefit those groups who are more likely to experience poverty or housing insecurity. Regarding the recommendations from Airbag, and I'm very well aware of the committee's interest in the Scottish Government's progress against their recommendations. That is why, along with the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government, I wrote to this committee last week to update you on the Scottish Government's progress against these recommendations made by the group. Regarding accountability, I will continue to champion the 3 principles of human rights budgeting. And I note that in the recent Spice blog on pre-budget scrutiny, colleagues recognise the personal accountability that I take in my ministerial role. Although I'm not directly responsible for budget decision-making, I take my role in mainstreaming equality and human rights very seriously, and I will continue to do that, that I can hold myself and colleagues accountable. I'm already looking ahead to how we can how we can continue to improve our processes next year. And with this in mind, I will build upon the collaborative partnership developed last year with the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government to improve equality and human rights in the budget process. In addition, when I last spoke to this committee in November, I outlined my plans to carry out one-to-one engagements with my ministerial colleagues. To date, I have held 9 meetings, with more in the coming weeks. I have been clear that as ministers, we have a shared obligation to tackle inequality and progress human rights. I have put across to my colleagues the importance of ensuring that equality impact assessments are carried out from the outset of policy development. I have asked them to highlight to their officials the importance they place on high quality and frank impact assessments as a key tool to inform decision-making. This remit to fully assess the impacts of our proposed policies includes spending cuts, which is critical. So, in conclusion, Convener, I hope this committee recognises this government's commitment to continuing improvement in equality and human rights budgeting and the actions we are taking to achieve this. I absolutely acknowledge that there is more to be done and will continue to listen and to use the feedback from this committee and other stakeholders. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Minister. We're now going to move on to questions from members. And I'm going to start, Minister, you touched on this in your opening statement, but can you perhaps expand on which changes to the Equality and Fairer Budget Scotland statement were identified and made as part of its work with the Equality and Human Rights Budget Advisory Group?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. The Equality and Human Rights Budget Advisory Group make a significant contribution in helping us to achieve our ambition for Scotland to be a global leader in equality and human rights, and we're hugely grateful for their guidance, leadership and recommendations, which we continue to progress, including our approach to this year's EFSBS. As noted in my letter to this committee last week, out of the 22 actions, 9 have been completed, 12 are in progress, with 1 yet to get underway as it is contingent upon the completion of another action. This included undertaking a structured review of the 2024-25 EFSBS and discuss the findings with the group, agree in partnership with Airbag an approach to this year's EFSBS, implement improvements to budget guidance by providing portfolios with a handbook, and better integration with the programme for government.
Thank you, Minister. Could the Minister explain why the use of human rights budgeting principles in explaining the approach to decision-making within the Equality and Fairer Scotland budget statement has been abandoned?
Well, I would say that the use of the human rights budgeting principles remain part of the budget process. And with regards to the publication, in our attempt to streamline and make the document more accessible, we had to focus our efforts on those parts of the publication that we thought would add most value to the readers. We have set out our approach to human rights budgeting in detail over the last 2 years, and since there has been little change in the principles behind the government's approach to human rights budgeting, this year we focused on the document. We focused the document on analysis of the key budget decisions, and the 6 key questions developed with Airbag were used as part of case study approach, and that includes 2 questions that were specifically asked about how human rights impacts have been considered. And additionally to that, Convener, the portfolio summary chapters tied portfolio budget activity to both human rights articles and national outcomes.
Thank you, Minister. There's been a suggestion that basing the equality statement on equality impact assessments is a flawed approach due to the lack of proven impact upon EQIAs. Can the Minister respond to this, please?
Yeah, if you just give me a wee second, because there's a lot of information that I want to make sure that I get. Right, I think, can you just repeat the last bit of your question again for me there?
No, absolutely. It was just to seek your response that there had been suggestions that basing the equality statement on equality impact assessments has been a flawed approach due to the lack of proven impact upon EQIAs.
Yeah, so we know that EQIAs are an essential tool in the policy development to help us better understand and address the needs of people that we serve. And the best way to understand the impact of budget measures, including on marginalised groups, is through thorough, high-quality, robust evaluation. So I'm absolutely resolute in my stance that good quality EQIAs should underpin everything that we do, and I do push back on that idea that they don't have an impact. The Scottish Government has continued to improve in this area and provides training materials, online guidance, best practice examples and impact assessment surgeries to support the completion of good quality equality impact assessments.
Thank you, Minister. We'll now move on to questions from Pam Gossel, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister, and good morning, officials. My question is around gender budgeting pilot. Basically, it's found that the Scottish Government lacks strategic overarching gender goals. To give an example of that, while I understand the importance of fighting both domestic violence and poverty, however, what we need to understand is how do both areas link? And another example could be a woman coming from a BAME background or a woman making less than a male counterpart, and us trying to measure how this affects how she raises her family. The pilot has also found that there is a need to move away from current portfolio-based budget model and towards a more performance-orientated approach. Therefore, I wanted to ask the Minister what actions is the Scottish Government taking on this feedback to make sure that there's that kind of cross-departmental links, and you did mention that you have been speaking to other ministers, but it'd be good to understand, like, from the impact assessments, are they being done on their own, or are you doing them kind of linking and cross-checking?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. There's a lot in that question. I'll do my best. If I please prompt me to come back on anything that I have missed. Regarding the gender budgeting pilot and the overarching goals, I mean, obviously, I welcome the recommendations from the OECD to improve gender budgeting, and the Scottish Government sort of like recognises that recommendation to develop those goals. We are actively considering Scottish gender goals, and in particular how this recommendation intersects with recommendations from the First Minister's National Advisory Group on Women and Girls. We're also working with the First Minister's National Advisory Group on Women and Girls to identify options to develop gender goals with women and girls with diverse lived experience, including BAME women. We're also exploring how to progress the second recommendation by the OECD about the changes that would be required to the budget process, being mindful that adaptations will be necessary to suit Scotland's specific circumstances. And I do note that the OECD itself recognises that actually there is no country in the world that, you know, has actually managed to achieve that. We're all on that journey, and there is a lot of work that is a long-term commitment that has to be specific to, in this case, into Scotland. With regards to your further points regarding cross-portfolio working and that intersectionality, I suppose, that would lead to good practice when it comes to completing good quality equality impact assessments. That has been part of my discussions with the 9 ministers that I have already met. And what I am able to do by speaking to all of my colleagues is that I'm able to spot the overarching connectedness across their portfolios. And an example I could give, for instance, is in housing. And speaking to, I've got a meeting coming up with the Housing Minister soon, but within that, I can already spot the and bring to his attention issues of so I'll use ethnic minorities since yourself brought that example up. The disproportionate impact of housing policy and budget decisions can make on that particular protected characteristic group. Now, that is in one portfolio, but then I can also spot in, say, in local government, for instance, the need to have access to services and the provision to be in communities. Then that also links with transport. And we know that members from the protected characteristics group are more likely to use public transport, less likely to have access to private. So then during my conversations with the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, I'm able to then link those policy areas together. So my role is not to make their decisions for them, but it is to highlight these intersectionalities, to get them talking to each other, and to get them, more importantly, to do that prior to making any decisions. And so that is the change of approach. So I can assure the committee that I am robustly challenging my colleagues to consider those things, come out of our silos, and move towards that outcome rather than portfolio base. And I am aware that the effect of that approach is going to take a long time, because we're talking about people behaving differently and a cultural change that's required to do that. Ministers have been very receptive, and they've been very grateful for the oversight that I'm able to provide. It's early days, and I am realistic about the impact that it would have had on this year's budget. It would have been minimal due to me coming into my role at the time that I did. However, I am expecting a difference, and I will be holding them account as they hold me account, as you hold us all to account, and more importantly, the general public, because that at the end of the day, that's what we want to see. And I want to see that cut through, that the person, the family that you mentioned, Ms Gosel, that they're actually feeling that tangible difference and they can see that connection between their lives and the decisions that ministers are making. Realistically speaking, I think the most significant impact will be in year 3, because I'm doing a lot now to change that infrastructure, and that takes time to do that well. Thank you.
I thank the Minister for that response. It's good to hear that you're probing at the other departments and the 9 other ministers to make sure that they look at the kind of intersectionalities, to make sure things are looked at, even when it's housing, the people that basically are victim survivors of domestic abuse, and how we reflect how when they're in housing and the fact that how they need housing, but it'll be very different from a day-to-day a different person. Now, it's sad to see that obviously, we are going to have the budget this afternoon and that it hasn't been reflected fully. I mean, I don't know how much it's been reflected. It would have been good to see that something like this, that the government would take it serious enough to see that, if this happens, because we cannot look at areas in silo anymore. But it's good to see that you're doing the work and you're pushing it. Hopefully you'll push it more next year as well. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I absolutely take on board and totally agree with your comments regarding silo working. That is something that I hear very commonly. However, I have mentioned it before, is that when I'm in that position of asking people to come out of their silos, they always say, yeah, somebody else should do it, but not me. And that's just a general human nature thing, isn't it? There is a bigger structural issue here, because humans are complex, we know that. And they don't see themselves in a silo. And yet, even our parliamentary structures, our committees, our whole systems are based on individual portfolio areas. So it is, in fact, a challenge for all of us. And I'm certainly doing it in the most robust way that I can. Thank you. Thanks.
We now have questions from Marie McNair, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister and your officials. Minister, I'd like to ask how you're supporting the development of a greater intersectional equalities competence across portfolios and public bodies, and you touched on it slightly earlier, but I just wondered if there's anything else that you would like to expand on.
So with sort of like intersectionality regarding sort of like mainstreaming, is that, yeah, are you referring to, I think with sort of like, there is an increased use of intersectional evidence and analysis to inform policy making across the Scottish Government. And this is helping us to understand the structural inequalities and inform inclusive policy making. Analysts and policy professionals, and I will bring in Nick shortly here, they are building their understanding of how to apply intersectional approaches, and practical considerations are set out in the intersectional evidence review that examines the experience of, for instance, minority ethnic women, and that was published in December. The committee will be aware of that. So when undertaking intersectional sort of research, analysts are encouraged to use both qualitative and quantitative sources of data and evidence to ensure a deeper understanding of intersectional issues. And then, of course, what we need to do is to triangulate those to make sure that we get the best evidence possible and the clearer picture. Nick, can I bring you in here?
Sure. Yeah, just to add a bit more of that on work at an official level. So I suppose to reflect on that both from an analytic perspective, so further work on data and evidence, but also work on the application of that evidence within policy work by officials and advice to ministers. So on the data and evidence front, we've got the continuing work of the Equality Data Improvement Plan and the recent interim review of the Equality Evidence Strategy. Within that plan, there's a whole series of actions that are focused on specific action in relation to intersectional data across different policy areas. And the evidence review has similarly continued to point to the importance of mainstreaming equality. The report that the Minister mentions, the evidence review of experiences of minority ethnic women, I think does two things. One, it points to key disparities that are experienced, intersectional disparities that are experienced by ethnic minority women, and so that's findings for policy areas where those disparities are to consider in the coming period. But also there's learning from a research perspective about the ways in which we can get better at that data and evidence. And it points to the importance not just of quantitative data, numbers, but also the qualitative evidence about the experiences, those intersectional experiences. From a policy perspective, intersectionality is included in internal training materials for policy officials developed last year, and there are 3 different standards under the policy profession in which there is intersectional training. And we're due to publish under the Public Sector Equality Duty new equality outcomes by the end of April. And we're looking at data and evidence as being one of those outcomes, and intersectional evidence being a component of that. So I'm trying to give you a sense of, at official level, a range of different kinds of activities, both in terms of policy use of consideration of intersectionality, and then the data and evidence that can inform and drive that.
Thank you. Minister, I noted that the Scottish Women's Budget Group highlighted 4 examples of policy areas where information on equalities consideration is lacking, those being the Scottish Welfare Fund, maternal health funds, carer support plans and housing and homeless. You've obviously touched on housing there. Could you possibly give a bit of background as to why this is the case? And again, maybe your officials will pop in as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can bring Nick in, or actually it would be Matt, would be better on this one, actually. Yeah.
Happy. So we set out the impacts of all budget choices in the level 4 tables that are published alongside each budget. The critical thing is the budget is an allocative event. It is not asking portfolios to take every single decision that they're going to take on the use of those funds at each through the financial year, because that is a decision for cabinet secretaries. So what we're doing on the face of the budget is allocating public money across the piece. Now, across those 4 specific areas, I can't comment on the specific decision that cabinet secretaries took in conjunction with their cabinet colleagues. What I can say is that the budget process is based around a process where cabinet secretaries have opportunity to speak to each other based on first a set of provisional allocations where they look at what that would mean for how they might need to spend money through the year ahead, and then they can feed back to the First Minister and the Cabinet Secretary of Finance through the Cabinet process to say these are where the challenges will be, these are where the particular qualities issues might come up, and there are multiple checkpoints along the way to raise those issues, so that when the First Minister, the Cabinet Secretary of Finance present that draft budget, it's based on the advice of Cabinet Secretaries that is fed in all along the way.
Thanks, that's really helpful for the committee. Convener, I'm just going to hand back to yourself. That's me.
Thank you. Now move on to questions from Maggie Chapman, please.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning to the Minister and officials. Thank you for joining us this morning and for your comments so far. I'm following on from Marie and questions around mainstreaming, sort of ensuring that equalities and human rights are everybody's business. The Scottish Human Rights Commission chair was quite clear that it shouldn't just be within the remit of this committee, but and you've described the work you've done with government colleagues. But I suppose I'm interested in exploring how we can ensure equalities issues, perhaps in the specific case today, issues of autism and neurodivergence, how we can ensure that they are taken seriously by portfolios across Parliament and indeed public bodies across Scotland that the Scottish Government funds. I think we've probably all heard too many stories of autistic people being fobbed off, not listened to, misdiagnosed, given treatments that don't work and actually could cause potentially further harm, autistic people who've been arrested, made homeless. And all of this costs the taxpayer much more money and costs different departments across both government and local government much more money. And that's before we even consider the life-changing impact, the detriment that all has to those individuals and their families. And I think even more galling is when some of these harms are brought to light, public bodies close ranks and we don't take the human rights and equalities agenda seriously. So can I ask the Minister how you've been working with colleagues to try and ensure this kind of waste, and it's a waste of resource, but it's a waste of human potential as well. How this doesn't happen, how we can minimise this, how we can get away from the stress and the detriment that this causes. I've got a follow-up from that, but I'd be interested in your comments on that.
Yeah, thank you for that, Maggie. And you'll be well aware of my years in education that sort of like, you know, I still feel very, very passionate for children in particular, but I include adult, you know, that are neurodivergent and autism, and I would include dyslexia within that as well. And what you're describing is heartbreaking, and yes, we should absolutely, you know, be doing better. And I would argue that we are, that those issues are being taken very seriously, and the approach that I've already outlined to the committee of getting portfolios to speak to each other. So the case that you raised in particular, there are clear correlations there, and you know, cross-working that needs to happen between the health budget, which is you know, it's a substantial budget there, also education are two. There will be other areas as well. Housing will come into this, health and social care will come into this, and I think that challenge of all of us as elected members with portfolio responsibility have that duty to not just take care of our own patch, but to recognise what can happen. And I think you alluded to it in your question, is that a decision in one portfolio area that is with the best of intentions could actually have an unintended consequence and deprive somebody of a service in another one. Also, there are areas of duplication that can happen, all of that kind of thing. So that work that I'm doing, for instance, the Equality Network representatives that I met. So that's never been done before, for a minister to have had that meeting with those folk that are working incredibly hard at local authority level. I brought together all 32 local authorities to do that. So that should give you an indication of trying to get to the heart of our public services, and in that case, our local authorities in particular, who are direct providers to the folks that you mentioned of many of those services. So those steps that the Scottish Government is taking to build that competence and capability across the public sector. We've also got the online mainstreaming strategy toolkit, which will be published later this year, and that will provide resources for officials across the public sector to increase their competence in equality, inclusion and human rights. Now, those resources are going to include guidance, checklists, training materials and best practice examples. The content is being developed by working groups with representatives from key stakeholders, and the aim is to support policy officials with pragmatic steps that they can take to support their mainstreaming journey. We're also moving forward in building our capacity in inclusive communications, and we're committed to embedding this across the public services. I know that with regards to our public sector equality duty, I'm due another visit to the committee regarding that, so we can go into that in further detail. But I hope that gives you some kind of indication that not only is there visible leadership in this area, of making sure that we have different ways of working, but also empowering the officials that are working. In this case, the example I gave was local authorities, but that equally applies to third sector and my extensive meeting with duty bearers, for instance. But also, we need to provide people with the support that they need to do that. You can't just say, well, this is what I expect, because people come back and say, well, how am I meant to do that? You know, where are the resources? Where is the support? So I think I've given a reasonable account of how we're doing that as well.
Thank you, Minister. That's helpful. And in your opening remarks, you talked about the training, the competence and capability training that's happening. And I suppose, given that actually at the heart of what we're talking about here is prevention, and this goes back to Campbell Christie's prevention, those principles of prevention that are over 10 years old now, and I think still require a lot of work to be implemented. You talked also about the need for cultural and behaviour change. I suppose some of the challenges are when people are at a point of crisis, of either being made increasingly ill or homeless or worse, there isn't always the mechanism for saying, this is exactly what we need to do. We can see exactly what we need to do. How do we do that? And that's not necessarily about resource. It's about that transparency and accountability that you also talked about in your opening comments. So I'm wondering, we can maybe pick this up beyond this meeting, if that would be okay. I think there's some very specific questions that it's not appropriate for me to ask here, but I'd be interested in picking some of this up with you beyond this meeting, if that would be okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Please do write to me with any supplementary questions that you have. I'd be absolutely fine. Can I bring Nick in, please?
Yeah, just on that point about transparency and accountability, and I mentioned that the government will be producing its new equality outcomes on the public sector equality due at the end of April. Of course, the committee will know that's a duty that sits on all public listed authorities, and we have had a series of engagements that the Minister reflected on in her opening remarks with public listed authorities in the autumn-winter time about our equality outcome setting, deliberately to provide some leadership and share our thinking about the setting of equality outcomes. And I think from our perspective to elevate the status of that equality outcome setting process. So I might invite the committee to look at what those other public listed authorities choose to do in relation to their equality outcome setting. We've shared with them where we're intending to go, but obviously they're making their own decisions about the equality outcomes that they want to set, and that might be in terms of that transparency and accountability. As we're all then required to report on that in 2 years' time. So that's a very strong mechanism for accountability.
Thanks, Nick. That's helpful, and I'll certainly take you up on that offer, Minister. Can I move on to my next chunk of questions are around human rights budgeting, more generally, I suppose. And you will remember from your time on this committee, Minister, all the challenges and questions around data. Who has the data, where it's available? And there's a substantial amount of data available and we think it informs budget decision-making, but the EFSB statement doesn't actually describe how it informs decision-making. Could you just say a little bit more about that relationship between all of this, sometimes really good data, sometimes data with a lot of gaps, but how does that actually inform the decision-making for you and for your colleagues?
Thank you. And, it goes without saying that sort of like having good quality, robust data is essential. And there are always calls for having more of it. And I hear quite clearly calls for that intersectional data as well, and how that can inform good policy making. The EFSBS uses information gathered from portfolios to support ministerial decisions as part of the budget process. And this year, the document also included new analysis on the impact of some areas of public service spending, and that was provided in the distributional analysis. So Chapter 1 of the EFSBS also sets out how the budget process integrates evidence on equality and fairness, included through the ministerial workshops, and better integration with the programme for government. The budget does not determine, as Matt said, every single decision for government and Cabinet Secretaries. They will consider the evidence available within their many decisions outside the budget process as well. And as an example, data was very clearly used in the setting of tax and social security policy, as demonstrated through the distributional analysis document. So when it came to I can expand a little bit further on the tax example that I've raised. And we know, for instance, that there are different outcomes regarding men and women, and then also breaking that down into women, for instance, ethnic minority women or disabled women. So it's sort of so that is an indication of that layer upon layer that we need. The other thing, and I think I did mention it at the previous committee as well, is that I am very mindful personally of making sure that we have the robust data sets that we need and we have enough data, because sometimes you're drilling down so much that you're actually talking about like very, very small numbers. Now, those numbers will tell a story, but it will not be a complete story. And that's why I keep saying that it has to be qualitative as well as quantitative. And then if you triangulate that with the voice of lived experience, then you get a clearer picture upon which to make decisions. Because if we were making decisions purely based on numbers, well, clearly that would further sort of like exacerbate situations for those that are already marginalised, and we want to make sure that that absolutely doesn't happen. But maybe I could bring Matt in on anything further.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, data's used throughout the budget process. We use it from, we take forecasts from the Scottish Fiscal Commission. That is all informed by data they're collecting on the state of the Scottish economy, that sort of thing. In the equality space, it's certainly most prominent in the information that we set out in the distribution analysis documents, and that's because that is the most easily accessible data. It tells us an awful lot about what the impact of changes to the tax and social security system would mean for families up and down the income distribution. It tells us what changes to the tax system would mean for the gap between genders, and because we know that men will tend to earn more than women. It's where we're looking to expand our capability, because we want to sort of understand more about how we can quantify the impacts of these types of changes. But as the Minister says, there's limitations to that, and the limitations come from the quality of the underlying data in the first place. That's the most prominent bit, but I would say that sort of through all the budget process, we are trying to gather information through cabinet secretaries, through portfolios, to understand what the impact of the propositions for the budget that we're putting forward would mean in practice. And that should be based around the best use of data, because we want to get value for money out of the money that we're spending. And therefore, we will be saying through all the budget processes we did this year, tell us about sort of what you know, what the evidence is that this money is having the impact that you think it's having. And that is then used to sort of inform the discussions around cabinets about the use of that money further down the line.
Okay. Thanks, Matt. That's helpful. And I suppose just following on from that, then, Minister, you mentioned the relationship between the work, the budget planning work, and national outcomes and human rights principles. I'm wondering what role the Equality Data Improvement Project Equality Data Improvement Programme has in supporting that direct sort of read through to national outcomes, and I suppose also sustainable development goals, because they open up the human rights space a little bit broader than the national outcomes do.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Yeah, so sort of, we're, the Scottish Government is continually in that process of improving equality and intersectional data collection, the analysis of it, the publication of it, and obviously when sample size allows as well, the robust disaggregation of that data. We strongly encourage that as well. There are 45 actions that are set out in the Equality Evidence Strategy and overseen by the EDIP project board that you had referred to, Ms Chapman, and that's the key mechanism through which we're advancing the equality evidence base. Those 45 actions cover improvements to all main equality variables. For instance, 33 cover data on race, 30 cover data on disability or long-term conditions, 16 cover intersectionality between the equalities variables. So I suppose as the Equality Evidence Strategy moves into its final year, the key task will be to work with all the analytical areas across the Scottish Government as well as external stakeholders to set out a new strategy for prioritising and filling remaining gaps in equality and in the intersectional data. So I am expecting that will include the expanding disaggregation of quantitative data sets where possible, obviously, with the sample sizes. Also utilising the qualitative and lived experience as well to allow for insight into differentiated experiences, which may not always come through the qualitative data. And, of course, drawing on the mix of evidence to identify the relevant research questions from an intersectional point of view. So in addition to the improvements above that we're working towards, we expect that policy areas to take a proportionate approach to the existing evidence base so that they have enough information to enable ministers to take equality-informed budget decisions.
Thanks. Can I have one final? Yes. Thank you. Sorry, last one for me. Given what you said about the value of lived experience, quantitative data, qualitative data, and that lived experience, can you explain why engagement and participation was largely absent from this year's budget process?
Well, we actually we've brought forward a budget that is set within the mainstream of Scottish public opinion, and that wouldn't have been possible without engagement and participation. We have worked in good faith with opposition parties to deliver a budget that can command the support of a majority of this Parliament, and I'm hoping that it will be voted through this afternoon, I believe. We have listened to and assessed the extensive proposals that were received as part of developing that budget. We have heard from a range of views from a range of stakeholders across Scotland from diverse communities, and the priorities of the third public and the business sectors as well. We can only deliver progress for Scotland with the support of our partners and Parliament, so we'll continue to do that.
Yes, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Questions now from Evelyn Tweed, please.
Good morning, Minister and officials. Minister, it was really good to hear that you've been meeting with ministerial colleagues on a one-to-one basis. Specifically, was the impact of geographical inequalities, including rurality, discussed?
I am going to be meeting with the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs very shortly, because there are many people, and I've got through 9 so far. So I am offering that anything that comes up today, I am quite happy to raise that at that meeting that is yet to come. So I suppose what you're talking about is sort of like that targeted funding that can happen to address specifically, you mentioned geographical issues regarding rurality and inequality. I understand the issues that are faced by marginalised communities that they face in remote, island and rural settings. So obviously we're committed absolutely to supporting those communities. One of the things that the First Minister has encouraged is for us, when we do our visits as ministers, is to actually visit cross-portfolio. So during the summer, during our sort of like summer tours of constituencies, I made a special effort to make sure that I visited rural and island communities and look at the provision for housing, so that I could actually speak to our delivery partners, but also to residents and potential residents as well, and communities, to see firsthand what the challenges were. And I wouldn't have known that if I was sitting just in Holyrood. So we're getting out and about and speaking to real people. So that's informing me, so I can be in a position then to challenge and support my colleagues as well. We do need to make sure that the services that we offer are tailored specifically for the challenges that people face. Now, of course, like everything else, rural impacts should be taken account of across all government, Scottish Government portfolios, meaning that good policy should already be thinking about the impact that policies have across Scotland, and that includes rural. So we do have the islands community impact assessments, and they must be carried out in relation to any policy or strategy or service that is likely to have an effect on island community, which is significantly different from its effect in another community, for instance. And they must also consider these impacts on different groups within an island as well. So I would say that that actually drills it down to actually what sometimes can be quite small numbers. And then that brings in our challenges that I was referring to earlier with having sort of like data sets as well. We are in the process of introducing a new systemic approach called the Rural Assessment Toolkit to aid this further and enable a greater focus to be applied to the unique needs of rural communities and businesses. So that toolkit will support civil servants to understand the unique characteristics, challenges and opportunities of rural areas and weave these through all the stages of policy development so that that policy, again, is being influenced early, thereby creating a more robust policy that is more reflective of the needs.
And you spoke about silos earlier. How difficult is it going to be for ministers to move out of silos and actually work across the whole of government on issues like rurality?
Well, I think I gave you an example of how we're already doing that by making sure that different portfolio areas are actually undertaking visits in communities and seeing projects that are not necessarily directly within your own portfolio. For instance, I mean, housing, obviously I take an Equality's interest in housing, but it is not my policy area. I don't have any financial decision making over it whatsoever. I'm lucky that it sits within the social justice portfolio, but nevertheless, me going out and seeing the challenges in real life, even, you know, the example that gave me a profound understanding was regarding the cost of building additional housing and the challenges around it. And the questions are, well, why are we not building more houses? Why are we not building them quicker? But then to actually be on the ground, see the landscape and the actual difficulties of drilling into what is pretty hard rock, as well as the transport of goods and services, being mindful of the skills that are required, but then also seeing the impact of other decisions that create inflated costs of goods and services as well. So by me seeing that, I am now in a better position to be able to challenge the Minister for Housing to make sure that these, now he'll be an expert on it, you know, obviously he will be, but from an equalities point of view, my extra lens that I'm putting on is then what happens if you are disabled. What then happens if you are building a new housing estate? Where is the nearest hospital? Where are the main transport routes? What is the availability? So I think that that is happening, and I hope that that gives you a good example. And what I'm trying to do is to show that visible leadership and encourage all ministers to do that cross-portfolio, not only talking, but also the walking.
Thanks, Minister. And, excuse me, would the Minister consider adding rurality within the Equality and Fairer Scotland budget statement?
Well, that sort of like, I suppose adding rurality as a specific dimension to the EFSB isn't something that we're considering at this time. The document focuses on our public sector equality duties and Fairer Scotland duty to both support the budget scrutiny and provide evidence of meeting our duties. I do think that portfolios are best placed to consider the rural impact of their policies and, where appropriate, consider these as part of their decision processes. Island impacts are considered separately as part of the budget process. Rural considerations are mainstreamed in the Scottish Government, meaning that good policy should already be thinking about the impacts that policies have across all areas, including rural.
That's me, Convener.
Thank you. We now have questions from Tess White, please.
Thank you, Convener. I've got, following up on my colleague on rural proofing and the rural proofing budgeting, got a couple of questions, Minister, on that, on spending cuts, and then I'm going into the next topic about where additional spending or spending is being earmarked. So my first on the funding cuts. So the SHRC published a report identifying the failure to meet basic international obligations in areas relating to the right food, the right housing, and we've talked about housing quite a lot this morning, the right to health and the right to cultural life in the Highlands and Islands. And the report has huge, massive implications for rural Scotland more widely. And you said in November when you met the committee, when I asked you, if you remember, I asked you about rural proofing, you said, and I quote, as Equalities Minister, I cannot be expected to deal with such in-depth detail on each portfolio. So my question, Minister, is how can you address obvious failings in equalities budgeting like these when you're not across the detail? And what are you going to do differently, in addition to talking to ministers, what are you going to do differently to address geographical inequalities? Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think that it's always a bit odd when you read something out and it sounds quite stark, doesn't it? So I wouldn't agree that I wasn't across the detail of it. However, you will understand that each portfolio has a specialism. So whilst I would be expected to have an overarching knowledge, I don't think that it would be reasonable to expect the Equalities Minister to have an in-depth knowledge of each single portfolio area. They are highly specialist and extensive, and I think that that is only reasonable. So regarding sort of like rural proofing, rural considerations are mainstreamed in the Scottish Government meeting that, as I said already, that good policy making should already be thinking about that. And as I've referred to in my earlier responses, the Scottish Government is in the process of introducing a new systematic approach called the Rural Assessment Toolkit. So this should aid further the greater focus that is required to be applied to the unique needs of rural communities and businesses. And as I've said, this will support civil servants to understand the unique characteristics, the challenges and opportunities, of course, as well. So that is sort of like a key principle, I suppose, of the successful development of a rural policy is meaningful engagement with rural stakeholders and communities at an early stage of policy development processes in order to consider how rural stakeholders can actually shape that policy. Now, the challenge will be for us is to make sure that that is visible, that their evidence is visible within that. And that's where I can come in as part of that support and challenge, is to track that voice. And we've talked about that before. And Tess White will know that I am very committed to making sure that as part of that transparency process, that when we're hearing from stakeholders, when we're hearing from people, that when we produce our documents, they can actually see that. But you will also be aware that there are many voices that come to the table, and there are many representations that are made. So obviously ministers and cabinet secretaries have that right to take on board everything that they hear, and then they will make those decisions. They are best placed to do that.
Perfect. Thank you, Minister. So I go on. So it's very encouraging that you say they're going to meet the Cabinet Secretary for Health, and that meeting is coming up. So thank you for that. And
for rural affairs and land reform. So that meeting is coming up, and I would offer that if there is anything that Tess White...
So I'm just about... Yeah. Yes, thank you. So I'm just bearing in mind we're the Equalities Committee, two areas that I would like you to take forward, and one has been raised by my colleague Maggie Chapman, but the first one is NHS Grampian. So NHS Grampian, huge rural area, is £250 million short of funding whilst the SNP have been in government, and it's a huge issue for NHS Grampian that's having massive knock-on impact on the IJB. And the second area that's highlighted by Maggie Chapman is assessments for autism and ADHD, and not just assessments. People are having to wait years, sometimes 2-5 years. They've got no date for assessments, and then there's a massive shortage of medication. So the concern that people have right now, if they fear and they've gone to the GPs and the GPs are saying, yes, you do need an assessment, they can't get an assessment. And the fear is that because there's a huge shortage of medication, that assessments are not going to be made. So it's like chicken and egg. But this is a massive issue. So the NHS is in crisis because of the short funding. Rural proofing, I've raised again and again and again. Neil Gray didn't recognise why £250 million figure that actually came from Spice. And then this huge issue that we've got in the North East with autism and ADHD assessments and medication. So I'm asking you, you said to my colleague that write to you, yes, those two areas, happy to write to you, and you having meetings. You've got a toolkit, which is a good step forwards, is please, we're in crisis in the rural areas, so thank you. My second, so that's money that's being taken away from rural areas. I'd like to just go on with the next section is around funding approaches. My background's business, and I always judge people, not by the words that they use, but where they actually spend their money. So we've talked about health. The next one is around... so you said in the last meeting, I did listen very carefully, Minister, you told MSPs in September that fund manager Inspiring Scotland will, and I quote, continue to work with the board of Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre as they implement the necessary changes recommended by Vicky Ling's report. However, after saying that in January, Rape Crisis Scotland U-turned on delivering a definition of woman, a key recommendation of Vicky Ling's report, and I'm sure you're aware of that, which means women remain in the dark about which services are male-free. And 2 weeks ago, you announced close to £2 million from that's £2 million from the Delivering Equally Safe Fund for the scandal-ridden ERCC and Rape Crisis Scotland. So my question, Minister, is what oversight do you have of this situation, given the seriousness of the report's findings and that public money, and it's really important, this is public money, taxpayer money, is being used to support these services. And this session is about transparency and accountability, Minister. So I'd like you to address that on the accountability and that spend. Thank you.
Thank you. With regards to your first point, me raising with the Cabinet Secretary for Health. Now, I believe that meeting may have, but regardless of that, yes, I'd be happy to take forward the 2 points that you raised regarding the NHS Grampian funding and regards to assessments of ADHD and the shortage of medication. So I'm happy to raise that. Regarding your second point, in the interests of transparency, I published the amount of money that we spend across my portfolio. We put that up. We didn't wait to be asked for it in any shape or form. It was published proactively. So the budget lines, as you quite rightly say, we procure services from organisations to deliver specific services that are required, be that in mental health, be that in providing refugees for domestic violence, a wide range in socialisation and loneliness, for instance. There are multiple projects, and we can see all those are listed with their budget lines next to them. Then what happens is that there is a clear sort of like contract, as it were, for the want of a better word, where the terms of engagement and the services and the quality of what we expect to be delivered. So yes, we fund helplines that are supporting people who are at high risk of suicide, for instance, as well. So there is a wide range of organisations that we fund to deliver a specific service. We then have fund managers who provide the governance over that process, and they are in regular contact with all of those organisations. They make sure that what the Scottish Government is paying for that service, that they are actually getting that service, and they do all the quality assurance. They are independent of that process to make sure that Scottish Government money is actually being spent on the services that we have procured. Now, many services will, of course, provide other things, because we do, there are third sector organisations, for instance, that we procure them to provide a particular service, but out with as an organisation themselves, they might be providing other stuff. But we're responsible for our bit.
I get it, but hopefully you appreciate that people out there are scratching their heads when they're going, money is being taken away from this and we're in crisis, but money is being spent on that. So you've shared with me that you are over the brief on that, and that £2 million.
I do believe that the overall budget for our Delivering Equally Safe strategy has increased. I think I was at the launch of that, actually. It was Women Say. That was an excellent visit. That is an organisation that provides support to women and girls from the age of 16 to 24 that are dealing with sexual abuse and violence, and they that was the opportunity. I think it was a 2.4 approximately uplift in that. Yeah, thank you.
So my follow-up and my last question, Minister, is we've talked about the funding in the equalities area, but I've been told that, and this is about accountability and transparency, so I have been told that one of your former SNP colleagues, Alison Thelwis, who appeared with you in a photo with banners saying decapitate TERFs, and refused to say whether she accepts the CAS report, has been hired by Rape Crisis Scotland. So if this is indeed the case, is this one hand washing the other, Minister? And do you recognise the concerns that Rape Crisis Scotland as a government-funded body...
Tess White.
I'm just finishing.
Tess White.
Convener.
Tess,
yes.
Please, can I have your attention? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, members. Just on that point and on that question you've just asked, we have to keep this relevant to the Minister's portfolio and why she's here today in regards to our budgeting inquiry, please.
And that's important. You know, my background's personnel and HR. One of the biggest spend is staffing, and also in terms of accountability and transparency, Convener. And I think this is very, very important. So if I can just finish. So it's a government-funded body, and it appears to be doubling down on its commitment to wiping out women-only spaces for survivors.
Tess White, please.
But if the Minister doesn't want to answer it, Convener, I can address that separately. Thank you.
We're just going to move on now. Thank you very much. Thank you. We have a supplementary question from Pam Gossel, please.
Thank you, Convener. As the Minister will know, violence against women and girls is one of the areas that I've paid great attention since I've become an MSP. And I often meet with many organisations in the violence against women and girls sector. For many of these organisations, particularly smaller and the less well-known organisations, the lack of funding has been a major issue. They say they need more certainty from the Scottish Government to be able to carry out the excellent work they do in helping women and girls, and many of which are survivors of domestic abuse. I wanted to ask the Minister what the Government is doing to ensure that these organisations have the certainty they need, especially in terms of funding, to carry out the important work helping women and girls.
Yes, thank you. Pam Goso raises a very, very important point on that, and I acknowledge her long-standing interest in that area. So, with regarding to sort of like, I suppose you're referring to advocacy groups in particular, because a lot of these organisations do provide that as a service. And we've taken the approach that we place both equality and human rights at the heart of everything we do. And you know, regarding the issues of sort of fairness, equality, dignity, respect and autonomy, empowerment and participation. So I suppose out of the 48 organisations being funded, 43 of those might be categorised as equality advocacy groups. And I think I can bring in Nick, who's got some further detail on this.
Just in relation to the question about funding, in the Equality, Inclusion and Human Rights Directorate, we've got a number of significant funds, and Delivering Equally Safe is the one that's focused specifically on supporting projects, organisations, services, tackling violence against women and girls. For all of those, all of that third sector funding, we issued letters of comfort before Christmas in relation to the continuity of that funding. And what we've been waiting for this afternoon is the completion of the budget process, and then we would be intending to send out renewed grant offer letters very shortly. So that DES funding, as with the EHRF funding, has been multi-year funding, but at the moment the grant offer letters are on an annual basis. So I hope that organisations will get that certainty very soon.
Thank the Minister for that response and the official. Can I just ask, Minister, you said 43 out of 48 are more kind of advocacy smaller. Is that what you're saying, that they're not the larger organisations, they're the smaller ones that are more niche in those areas? Because we know that there are organisations that deliver on helping people from BAME backgrounds, and sometimes that doesn't come to light, and they've got to prove by giving their figures and statistics to the government because they're not collected. And I certainly know that. That's why my domestic abuse bill was looking at that. There's certain data that's not collected. So it's kind of bottom up. It's coming up rather than top down, the information on data. I want to know, how much does that affect your decisions? And when you're saying, is it 43 out of 48, are you saying that the 43 are smaller organisations that are being funded, and there'll be 5 larger organisations? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I couldn't do that unless I had the list in front of me and then I could cross-check. I mean, I know my organisations, but unless, with the best will in the world, unless I've got that in front of me, it could be, it might not be, but so I can't give a definitive answer to that. What I can say to you is that it wouldn't necessarily be the size of the organisation. It's about the service that they provide. So that would be the important thing, because obviously the government wants to deliver services, and it's the organisation that is best placed to deliver that service. So the size of it is not the most significant factor.
No, thank you, Minister. That's good to hear, because it's about what the delivery is of the service. But some of them are sometimes small when they get missed out. But it's good to hear that they're not being missed out. Would you like me to ask question 15 as well? Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, thank you, Convener. There's often an assumption that anti-poverty measures will proportionally impact people from BAME backgrounds. However, that is not always the case. Therefore, can I ask the Minister what can be done to account for the differences in access and take-up of anti-poverty schemes from people of minority backgrounds?
Yes, absolutely. So you know, we know that sort of like families from black and minority ethnic backgrounds are one of the 6 priority family types identified in our Tackling Child Poverty delivery plan as being at the greatest risk of poverty. And we recognise that the intersection with other protected characteristics, including disability, increase the risk of living in poverty further still. So since 2018, the Scottish Government have strengthened the evidence base on poverty, building on a series of focus reports, including on minority ethnic families, outlining the challenges and barriers faced, as well as policy approaches which may be taken that are successful in addressing these challenges. Now, remember that tackling poverty and inequality is a priority for all ministerial portfolios, so those actions should be driven across the government to deliver on that progress. And that, of course, includes our work on more focused work, such as the take-up of devolved social security benefits, and sort of like benefits for seldom heard groups, and through our anti-racist employment strategy, which is focused on addressing structural barriers to enable more people from racialised minorities to access, sustain and progress in employment. I suppose understanding and addressing how we can address unacceptable levels of poverty for black and ethnic minority families, it's a shared endeavour, and we'll continue to drive that forward. And, you know, the member knows that I will do that as well.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, and thank you, Minister. That concludes our formal business in public this morning, and I thank the Minister and her officials once again for their attendance today. We will now move into our private session to consider the remaining item on our agenda. Thank you.